service is
Marian
Island. Marian Island was one of the first members, or the early members of this congregation. And a few years ago, I was conducting the Remembrance Day service at First Unitarian Church. And people were encouraged to wear red poppies. And Maria was at the back asking people to take off the red poppies and put on white poppies that she had made. And we've got some of Maria's white poppies up front. So she and I had a brief discussion then, and now that she is marching bravely towards death of bone cancer, I'm working with her to collect her biography. And our hope is that Unitarians can have different opinions and still be together. And that's the hope behind this service. As a society, what do we choose to remember? What memories are thrust upon us? And why do we hold public services of remembrance? What is the value of remembrance ceremonies? We think of Victoria services for Kristallnacht, for the remembrance of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. November 11th, of course, the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. July 1st, which is Newfoundland Memorial Day, or the World Trade Center Memorial on September 11th. In this homily, I want to say three things. After I remind you of a Greek epic poem, naturally, I want us to think together about what we publicly remember and why. Finally, I have some thoughts on a Unitarian response to public remembrance ceremonies. For 1,000 years or so, literature and much of culture in much of Western Europe, where many of us trace our roots, was based in part on the writings of ancient Greeks. European and even church philosophy was based on Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. What Europeans were taught about honoring warriors and mourning the dead came from a poet named Homer. The Iliad is one of two major ancient Greek epic poems attributed to Homer. It is one of the oldest extant works of literature still widely read by modern audiences. Set towards the end of the Trojan War, a 10-year siege of the city of Troy by a coalition of Greek states. The poem depicts several events in the siege's final weeks. In particular, it depicts a fierce quarrel between King Agamemnon and a celebrated warrior, Achilles. The Iliad is often regarded as the first substantial piece of European literature. Critical themes in the poem include glory, pride, fate, and wrath. The Olympian gods play a major role in the poem, aiding their favored warriors on the battlefield and intervening in personal disputes. Their characterization in the poem humanized them for ancient Greek audiences, giving a concrete sense of their cultural and religious tradition. Also from the Iliad, we get the idea of cenotaph, which is Greek for empty tomb, and the laying of wreaths, the traditional means of signaling high honors in ancient Greece. Honor and glory are central to the Greek character. Since heroes are the essence of the society from which they come, Greek heroes live their lives according to honor and glory in all their varied forms. Honor and glory trigger an epic war that takes the lives of numerous men and shapes the development of those men who survived. The fall of the city of Troy is a thing whose glory shall perish never, writes Homer. The goal of the Greeks is the fame that resounds even after death, and they let nothing bar their way. The honor of the individual, family, and community guide every action and response in the Trojan War. Honor and glory define the hero, and therefore are the foundations for every event in Homer's Iliad. In modern European wars, and ever since, we show honor to our war dead by following certain Homeric ideals, including singing to the dead and laying wreaths. These ideals link the Canada of 2022 with the Greeks of 4,000 years ago. Why do we keep doing these events? Sometimes it's clear from the purpose of remembering that the purpose of remembering is to honor lives lost, their memories, sacrifices, heroism, and lost potential. To honor is to hold in high respect. In the public sphere, such honoring is often accompanied by gratitude, sometimes by grieving, and occasionally by calls to step up to the legacy which we have been gifted. Sharon Brissolara writes about the challenges of striving for equity, and I feel that her writing can help us shape how we think of public acts of remembrance. In some places, the purpose of remembering is reconciliation, a committed step towards reckoning with the past together in order to heal as a community or the nation. Efforts aimed at truth and reconciliation, like ones that were started in Australia, South Africa, Rwanda, and now Canada, are recognitions of what is required to work together for a better future for everyone. Ongoing dialogue, grappling with history, consideration of the ethical imperatives of current and future actions. Brissolara continues, in this era of information silos and distrust of sources that seem to offer political views different than our own, the purpose of remembrance can also be to assert that events actually happened and that they were significant. Concerted efforts to rewrite history exist now and have existed in the past, and shape efforts to remember even in the recent past. We cannot change wars, harmful actions, ideologies, practices, and policies that were not our own and that occurred in the past. We can't change that these things happened or our relation to those who actively created or supported actions that we now find abhorrent or illegal. The actions of the distant past are not ones that we as individuals had an opportunity to even influence. And yet, if what happened is truly not in keeping with our understanding of who we want to be, then we are left with the decision to change the present for a better future or to reinforce the parts of the past that we want to. And the truth is, if we don't intentionally work for something different, then we are complicit in holding up structures and practices that emerged from the past. Brissolara concludes, we should reflect on what our remembrance of the past means for our present and our future. What we choose to ignore, omit, or revise leaves its own particular legacy and consequences. It is hard to find the honor and loyalty in denying the fact of deep harm or of attempting to distance ourselves from past events. We could engage in the process of public reflection, so the purpose of listening, learning, and healing together. A little bit more theory. Writing after the Second World War, philosopher-journalist Hannah Arendt suggested that memory, as elaborated by poets, should always be an exercise in education. And that's why we have poetry at public gatherings. For the very fact that so great of an enterprise as the Trojan War is remembered at all is because a poet wrote the stories. In Republic, Plato called Homer the educator of the Greeks because he immortalized the events of the Trojan War. Homer and Plato served to educate. And this is why we continue to hold public remembrance services and to recite poems like In Flanders Fields. Canadians began to commemorate their veterans and war dead as early as 1890, when Decoration Day began to be observed on the 2nd of June, the anniversary of the 1866 Battle of Ridgeway against the Fenians. Do we have any Fenians in the room today? Could be closet Fenians, who are Irish terrorists in Ontario, I think. A further observance was held on February 27th from 1900 to 1918 to commemorate the Boer War, because so many Canadians were involved in the Boer War at Paardeberg. The first Armistice Day commemoration was in 1919, a year after the end of the First World War, when King George V called on all countries in the British Empire to observe it. During the 1930s, the Member of Parliament for Nanaimo suggested that Armistice Day should be changed to Remembrance Day, and that the date should be fixed on November 11th. In Canada, Remembrance Day is a statutory holiday in 6 of 10 provinces. The Legion, the Royal Canadian Legion, is against making the day a national statutory holiday, in part because the day off aspect would eventually overtake the memorial purpose of the occasion. Whereas having schools in regular session on that day would be an opportunity for children to be taught the day's true significance in a mandatory fashion. In my opinion, to avoid lengthy Christmas creep, the conclusion of Remembrance Day should be the earliest acceptable time in which to start Christmas decorations and sales. And I'm getting an amen. For those on Zoom, you can't hear the amen. Veterans Affairs Canada says that November 11th is for the remembrance of men and women who have served and continue to serve our country during times of war, conflict, and peace. November 11th, according to Veterans Affairs, is primarily for the First War and Second World War, the Korean War, and all conflicts since then in which members of the Canadian Armed Forces have participated. A tradition of paying more personal tribute has emerged since 2000, that after the official ceremony, the general public placed their poppies atop the tomb. I don't know if you've seen that. And at First Unitarian Church, they do that. At the end of the service, many people come forward and leave their poppies on the table, signifying that Remembrance Day is now sort of over and we're going on with life. In 1994, National Aboriginal Veterans Day was inaugurated to recognize the contribution of Aboriginal soldiers to military service, particularly in the First World War, Second World War, and Korean War. And that's on November 8th. I haven't heard anything in the media about November 8th, so maybe it's up to us. The special memorial was created because First Nations weren't being recognized in Remembrance Day. Indigenous veterans had to overcome many obstacles to serve in Canada in these wars, and they did, including adjusting to new cultures, sometimes learning to speak new languages. They had to learn to speak English to serve. And they traveled long distances, even to enlist. The memorial to First Nations veterans was inaugurated in Winnipeg in '94 and has since spread nationwide. In 2001, Merchant Navy Remembrance Day was created by Parliament, designating September 3rd as a day to recognize the contributions and sacrifice of Canadian merchant mariners. I had no idea until I was looking into this service. It matters what we choose to publicly remember. Do we remember only veterans of the military? Do we include the civilian sailors of the Merchant Marine who kept Europe fed and fueled during the wars? Do we remember the First Nations soldiers in the Great War? Do we remember police officers who were killed on duty, like Constable Shaylin Yang, who was fatally stabbed last month by a homeless man in Vancouver? Incidentally, a few years ago, I was leading a Remembrance Day service at our sister Unitarian Church on West Saanich Road. An Iranian Unitarian veteran asked if he could participate, and I said yes. I learned that in Iran, their version of Remembrance Day is Sacred Defense Week, a commemoration of the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq War. That brutal, grinding war started when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. After 8 years, the war ended in stalemate with no change to national boundaries. The following year was a new dawn. The word for dawn is Sepideh, for the wounded of Iran, including the Iranian Unitarian at First Unitarian Church. He felt honored to participate in a Canadian remembrance service. Have you heard the term master narrative? Master narrative gets used by historians and sociologists. And I'm getting comments here about the animals killed in war. The master narrative is the one that we are told that we are to believe about a certain event. The master narrative is unambiguous and idealistic. We're taught the master narrative of the First World War is that Germany invaded a neighbor, and then we all piled in as the British Empire to defend Belgium, and 4 years of slogging it out in the mud of Flanders. And war is horrible, and our soldiers died for us. But there's always been a counter to the master narrative. Too many of us have only been reminded later that the appalling sacrifices of war are often pointless. Some Canadians find the counter narrative more compelling than the master narrative. And then there are other Canadians who find that the counter narrative people are worse than the master narrative people. And then we can lose hope in our fellow people. So I ask you, what if you find yourself watching a public remembrance and disagreeing with the form, function, and words of it? What if you cannot accept the master narrative? Few people question the master narrative of the First World War, nor of the defense of Europe from Hitler's tyranny. There are master narratives of other tragic events that we memorialize. What about the master narrative of 9/11, the Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks against the United States in September of 2001? How do you feel about those public remembrance ceremonies? And this leads me to my final point about a Unitarian Universalist response to public remembrance events. This ties to a larger theme about what Unitarian Universalists believe, if anything. Do we have a central belief? Dr. Emily Mace, who is a Unitarian historian at Harvard, she wrote that Unitarian Universalism's lack of and search for a center has received much attention in scholarly circles, while some of the discussion merely signals that we don't have a focal point. Much of it points towards imagining what a center could be. Are the principles the center point of Unitarian Universalism? Is the chalice and lighting a chalice the central point of Unitarian Universalism? And another historian implies that the diversity in the context of community itself, our diversity of thought and belief, is the center of Unitarian Universalism. That this attitude, deeply rooted in our past, is part of our definition of what we stand for, and hence who we are. We assert the right and duty of every one of us to adhere to our own understanding of religious truth, and we accept the obligation to respect one another, even if we do not always agree. Suzanne Myers agrees, suggesting in her article, The Curriculum of the Free Church, that the 3 C's of covenant, congregational polity, and conscience are the glues that are holding Unitarian Universalism's building blocks together. She writes, we are united not by our theological beliefs, but by the promises we make to each other. Finally, Robert Bella, who did the Ware lecture at the Unitarian National Gathering in 1998, turned the conversation about Unitarian Universalism center in the direction of ritual and symbol, the lighting of the chalice, the dropping of pebbles, or the lighting of candles. Those practices make our beliefs tangible and physical. But no serious consideration of ritual and symbol in relation to our identity as pluralists and creedless Unitarian Universalists has been written. The services after 9/11 in the Unitarian congregation in the United States made it abundantly clear that it was the words that joined Unitarian Universalists. Even if we didn't agree on the words, we agreed that words should be said unspoken. Words express the diversity of opinions in Unitarian Universalism. This diversity is found in the many, many different readings that might accompany a chalice lighting, or they express the joys and concerns of pluralistic UU congregations. Like the candles, words and phrases are the best possible expressions of Unitarian Universalism. They are not merely signs. Words themselves are the embodiment of UU community. While Unitarian Universalism's center might not be explicitly clear, it must be sought within these rituals. A Unitarian Universalist response, therefore, to public remembrances of wars, attacks, injustices, and defeats is therefore that we use our words voluntarily and freely. We do not have to agree. I doubt there could be a fixed Unitarian response to any master narrative. My friend Gary Groot, a Unitarian in Saskatoon, suggested that instead of saying Unitarians believe X, we should in fact probably more correctly say 80% of Unitarians believe X, 15% of Unitarians believe Y, and 5% disagree with the grammatical structure of the question. I wanted to tell you three things. I reminded you about Homer's Iliad because we all need reminders of Homer's Iliad. I wanted us to think together about what we publicly remember and why. And I shared some thoughts on a Unitarian response to public remembrance ceremonies. I look forward to a lively forum with Stefa as our moderator. And I invite us all to join the music team in singing Live in Peace, Domine da Pace. I'll turn it over to Dick and Attila and Kathy to start us off.